There's one microstructure remaining in section 1 of this second sublecture. It involves closure that operates in the last unit of section 1. That last unit is chapter 27, verses 1 through 4. You see it on the screen with the heading, The Second Cumulative Recap. 4 elements within this final unit of section 1 generate a keen sense of closure. First, the combined caution against presumptuous boasting and self-adulation together recall the earlier hazard of inclinations to greed, concerning which the sage cautioned. And he stretched that caution across the 4 relationships that occupied Block 1A. That is 25:13 through the remainder of chapter 25. Let's notice then in the first 2 verses of this second cumulative recap how the sage focuses on caution against presumptuous boasting and self-adulation, which we're taking as synonymous with a certain form of greed. 27 verse 1. Do not boast about yourself regarding tomorrow, for you cannot know what a day may bring forth. Verse 2. May a stranger praise you, and never your own mouth, a foreigner, and not your own lips. Actually, this topic of caution against greed, particularly regarding boasting and self-adulation, originated from the first sublecture, chapter 25, verses 6 and 7. Those read as follows, 25:6. Do not put on airs before a king, and in the place reserved for people of prominence, do not stand. For it would be better if he were to say to you, come up here, rather than demoting you in the presence of a prince, someone your eyes regarded. That's 25:6 and 7, showing that this caution against presumptuous boasting and self-adulation was anchored back in the first sublecture as a key principle that the sage would later unpack in later sublectures. We've seen him doing that in section 1A, and now as he comes to the second cumulative recap, verses 1 and 2 of 27, we see him returning to that theme, contributing to closure in a very profound way. Second closural component. Mention of the word fool in 27 verse 3 recalls the first of a trio of persons whom the sage said the courtier might expect to have coming to him and appealing to him for generous advocacy. That trio of persons occupies Block 1B. That starts in chapter 26:1. The first of those 3 was the stupid person, whom we find interlaced with the description of being a fool. Notice then that fool is the term here in the recap in 27:3. Let's read that. A stone is a heavy load and sand is a burden, but a fool's angry response is heavier than both. So the link between fool here in 27:3 as a closural device and the 12 verses dealing with the stupid person, that was 26:1 through 12, that link rests on the fact that the terms fool or folly appear nowhere else in this sublecture except in that lesson concerning the stupid fellow who appeals to the courtier's generosity. Within those 12 verses, we find the reference to a fool in verses 26:4, 26:5, and 26:11. Outside of that, those 12 verses regarding the stupid person, who is occasionally described as a fool, we discover fool or folly here in this second recap, 27:3 that we just read. And then one last time in this sublecture, its very last verse, which is 27:22. In fact, the concept of fool or folly appears twice in that final line. Now for the third closural device. The link between fool here in 27:3 and the stupid fellow of 26:1 to 12 is further reinforced by use of the root kaved. generating words that are translated glorious, or alternatively heavy. Glorious or heavy. So in 26:1 and again in 26:8, the sage explains that glory is ill-suited to a stupid fellow. Now notice 27:3, how the sage laments that a fool's angry response is heavy. Keep in mind, glorious and heavy come from the same Hebrew root, kaved. His angry response is heavier even than a burden of stone or sand. By use of this wordplay, the sage implies that the fool's nearest approximation of glory is a sorry imitation indeed. He can produce nothing but a burdensome load of anger. Like a load of stone or sand, no amount of refining, and that's a metaphor that weaves through these lectures, no amount of refining will convert his base character into anything of gleaming value. In fact, when we come to the last verse of the sublecture, again that's 27:22, the futility of attempting to refine a fool, the sage will plainly state in the sublecture's final verse, that is 27:22. Notice how that reads. If you were to pulverize a fool in a mortar with a pestle, together with hulled barley, his folly would not leave him. The fourth closural device involves reference to cruelty in connection with revengeful wrath in 27 verse 4. Notice the expression, rage is cruel and anger is a flood, but who can keep standing in the face of revengeful wrath? So this reference to cruelty in connection with revengeful wrath recalls the third and final person, whom earlier in Block 1b, the sage warned would appeal to courtiers for generous advocacy. That character was the seductive litigant. With his determination to take revenge, in 26:18, the sage described that fellow as a deranged person shooting flaming missiles, arrows with death. Again, we're noticing in 27:4 the theme of cruelty, and we're remembering the sage has already pointed out a character who, in a sinister fashion, is cruel. That was the third character of those three that the sage said these might come to you one day, asking you to support their cause. That third character was the seductive litigant. Focusing in again on 27:1-4, we can make this observation. Taken together, the fool and the revengeful person, and those are 27:3 and 27:4 respectively. The fool and the revengeful person, with their high degree of self-absorption, serve to remind the courtier to beware of persons who may seek him out as they apply for generosity and advocacy. These two verses then recall the first three units of section 1b, those three characters where the sage cautions against an inattentive sort of generosity. When we add to this pair of verses, 27:3 and 4, the warning against greed in the previous two verses, 27:1 and 2, then the whole of this final unit of section 1, namely 27:1-4, achieves a rich degree of closure, since 27:1 and 2 then recall the caution against greed that marked section 1a. Next, let's consider the microstructural features of section 2, that is 27:5-18. There are 5. First, thematic coherence within this section. Section 2, within the present sublecture, consists of 3 blocks that develop the theme of reproof. The first block establishes the worth of reproof, and it outlines how to obtain it. That spans 27:5 all the way through verse 10. You notice the heading 2a, Receiving Reproof, the Importance of Relationships and Receptivity. So it's establishing its worth and how to receive it. In the second, the sage will explain how to dispense reproof, and he will illustrate it with negative models, 2 of them. That spans verses 11 through 16. See that in the lower left? Dispensing reproof, undergirding principle, and failed models, 11 through 16. In the closing block, the sage describes a pair of relationships in which reproof operates optimally. That will be verses 17 and 18. You can see that on the right side, block C, relationships that successfully foster reproof. Next, let's study the microstructure that involves the progression of thought across section 2. The teachings about reproof found in section 2 transcend a logical progression. Before urging the pupil himself to be an exponent of reproof, that happens in verses 11 through 13 of chapter 27, before doing that, the sage builds a case for the value of reproof. Notice verse 5. Better is reproof revealed than love kept secret. And he does so despite the pain that reproof can inflict. That's verse 6. To be trusted are wounds from one who loves, but manipulative are kisses from one who hates. The sage further shows that to be most effective, reproof must arise within the context of relationships, rendered trustworthy through long cultivation. This is also evident within verse 6. To be trusted are wounds from one who loves. Implication there is that there's an undergirding relationship already established, and a person with a committed sense of caring issues a reproof, and although it may sting, you know this person is doing so not to undercut you, but because they care about you. So reproof must arise within the context of relationships rendered trustworthy through long cultivation. That's in verse 6, and we find the negative side of this in verse 8. As a bird wandering from its nest, that's where relationships are broken. Sustained relationships are out of place. So is a person inclined to wander from his place. When a person leaves his familiar network of trusted friendships, then he does not have access to loving reproof. Another component concerns the importance for the recipient to greet this reproof with a robust appetite, drawn to it by its fragrant appeal. This we find both in 7 and 9. 7 reads, "A satisfied appetite will trample on a honeycomb." What he's saying there is if you're already full, even the sweetest of food you will reject. But as for a hungry appetite, anything bitter is sweet. If you really are hungry, then you'll put up with things that are bitter. That's analogous to a wound of a reproof that stings. Verse 9, "Perfume and incense may delight the mind, but sweetness of its friend issues from advice regarding appetite." Advice regarding appetite, this is reproof. What if someone says, "Hey, I think you're overindulging in such an area of life?" That's reproof. That should be greeted as if it's something sweet. It should be analogous to something that is perfume and incense. We should be drawn to reproof. We should value it that much, even though it may hurt. We should train ourselves to value it, to realize how valuable it is. So all these principles occupy the first block, that is block 2a, verses 5 through 10, and they talk about receiving reproof, how important are relationships in this process, and how important is receptivity, having an appetite for it, recognizing it's like perfume. Then, once the pupil has tasted the value of reproof, he's in a position to pass that benefit along to friends in need. Now he's not a recipient of reproof, he's an exponent of reproof. The son or pupil who attains this milestone, that is maturing beyond consuming reproof, now turning to dispense reproof, he thereby gladdens the father or the sage. That's verse 11. We can see it here at the top of the screen on the right side. Be wise, my son, make my mind joyful, so I may have something to reply to one who reproaches me. All right, so whatever the sage is about to encourage the pupil or son to do, if he enacts it, it will make his father or his teacher joyful. Next, the father establishes the grounds for issuing reproof. It's as if he's saying to the pupil, to the son, in case you're wondering whether or not you are on good grounds for issuing reproof to someone, in case you're wondering, what do I have to say? Why should I speak into that person's life? He says, here is the bedrock. Here's the reason we do this kind of thing. It all rests on this principle. And here it is, verse 11. A shrewd fellow observed misery. He took cover. A naive fellow blundered forward. He was fined. So the bedrock of all wisdom, and particularly here we're thinking wisdom that takes on the shape of reproof, is this. Wisdom, which is here tagged as shrewdness, a shrewd fellow observed misery. Wisdom entails the ability to anticipate impending disaster so as to take evasive action. Once again, wisdom entails the ability to anticipate impending disaster so as to take evasive action. On the other hand, now we're moving to part B of verse 12, the naive cannot see so far ahead. So they need the gift of reproof from friends with better distance vision than they possess. It's again, the father, the sage, is offering verse 12 as the foundation legitimating the issuance of reproof. That particular verse is not just a casual, incidental verse, a filler. It's very much saying, here's why we do what we do. And if you want to care about your friend, if you want to help them avoid impending disaster just as you're able to do, then please let them in on what you see, what they are blind to. Now, in case the youth is willing to issue reproof but unsure exactly how to do it, the sage next provides a pair of pointed, imperative instructions. We're looking at verse 13. If, for example, the friend he's concerned about is lured by an appetite for ill-advised gains, then the youth must grab him by the lapels. 13a. Let's read that. Grasp his garment if he guarantees a loan for a stranger. On the other hand, is his friend lured by an appetite for illicit sexual pleasure? Then the youth must intercept him. This is the language of intervention, isn't it? Going so far as to tie him up to prevent such self-inflicted harm. 13b. And if he goes so far as to a foreign woman, tie him up. This is reproof in physical form, maybe metaphoric, but it's certainly vivid and visual, isn't it? Looking back then over block 2b, verses 11, 12, and 13, here's what we find. As regards how to go about issuing reproof, the sage begins, verse 11, by commenting that this process is anchored in the father's joy. He will be so proud of the son, the sage will be so proud of the pupil if he matures to the point of actually imitating the father, the sage, and becoming an exponent of reproof. That's verse 11. The second part is the sage issues the foundational principle undergirding reproof. That's verse 12. And third, to be an exponent of reproof, the sage issues specific instructions concerning the urgency of intervention-styled reproof. And these three together comprise this first unit of Block B, verses 11, 12, and 13. And now we progress to the second unit of this block, beginning with verse 14. As if anticipating how, despite good intentions, inexperienced reproof may go awry, the sage then gives two models of messages that are guaranteed to fail. In essence, he's saying, whatever you do, don't issue reproof in these two manners. The first underscores the fact that even a message of affirmation, that is, of blessing, not reproof, will flounder and backfire if poorly timed. Evidently, insensitivity concerning timing was an error typically perpetrated by men in the sage's acquaintance. Notice verse 14. One who blesses his neighbor with a loud voice, rising early in the morning, a curse will be reckoned to him. We might wonder, does this have anything to do with reproof? Admittedly, it's not talking about reproof, it's talking about issuing a blessing, an affirmation. But if poorly timed, it will backfire. The implication is this: if timing is critical even for words of affirmation, how much more critical is timing when the message involves confrontation? And now verse 15. Similarly, reproof poorly metered, that is, if it's issued in an incessant flow of scolding, it will fail equally, a fault which the sage evidently registered among women. Notice verse 15. An incessant dripping on a persistently rainy day, that is what a contentious wife is like. Conversely, sensitive timing and short duration, these traits by implication would constitute the hallmarks of effective reproof. So we see that the trio of verses spanning 14 through 16 comprise the second unit of Block 2b, and these entailed failed models for reproof. Such negative models, that is, poor timing and excessive duration in reproof, would naturally generate the question, if not thus, then how should I go about issuing reproof? So the teaching on reproof closes with two winsome relationships in which reproof may thrive. We're coming now to Block 2c. You see it on the right side of your screen, 27 verses 17 and 18, labeled Relationships that Successfully Foster Reproof. In the first, verse 17, we see that reproof flows reciprocally in a mutual relationship so that both parties will benefit. Intensity escalates with an imperative tone at this point, since the term sharpen in both hemistichs employs what we call adjussive form, calling forth an action in a sort of a quasi-imperative. That's what we mean by using the word may in verse 17. May iron by iron grow sharp, and may a person sharpen the face of his friend. There's reciprocal benefit of reproof. Having said that, in verse 17, we should acknowledge that a certain sort of wisdom, and with it the subsection reproof, wisdom as reproof, sometimes lies out of the reach of one's peers, those that are on the same level in this reciprocal relationship of verse 17. Since one's superiors, particularly the sages who were above men beyond the pupil in wisdom experience, since they are capable of accessing a deeper store of wisdom, the wise youth, the wise courtier, will cultivate just such a subordinate superior relationship. And that's what we see in verse 18. Notice how it reads. One who guards a fig tree will eat its fruit, and one who guards his master will be given glory. So, as with peers in verse 17, these two parties mutually benefit. The fig tree is glad someone's taking care of it, and the caretaker is glad to benefit from the fruit of the fig tree, as a metaphor for a subordinate superior relationship. Certain tangible needs of the master sage are supplied by the youth's solicitous care, while the reproof-grade wisdom bestowed by the master serves to refine the youth's raw material of character, so that at last the youth, the courtier, may successfully attain that ultimate goal which is glory. Mentally reel back to chapter 25, verse 2, where we find that glory is what this teaching is about, how to achieve a magnificent monarchy. In the next video, we'll continue our study of microstructures in section 2.